The wind began softly long before sunrise. Far out beyond the farms beside the Nile, the desert was already awake in darkness. Fine grains of sand moved slowly over empty ground. Small ridges formed and disappeared again beneath the night sky. The air carried a dry warmth even before the sun arrived. In the distance, low hills rested quietly beneath pale stars, and the sleeping villages near the river remained still for a little while longer. Most homes were silent at this hour. Inside small mud-brick houses, families slept close together on woven mats laid over hard floors. Some rested beneath thin linen cloths. Others slept beside open windows covered with reeds that allowed cooler air to drift inside during the night. Clay jars of water stood near the walls. Baskets of onions and barley rested quietly in corners beside grinding stones and folded cloth. The darkness inside the homes felt thick and calm. Children breathed softly in their sleep. Workers rested heavily after long days beneath the sun. Some men still carried dust beneath their fingernails from carving stone or hauling heavy baskets at construction sites near temples and royal tombs. Farmers slept with sore backs and tired legs after hours spent bending near wet river soil. Fishermen smelled faintly of river water and reeds even while sleeping. Outside, the village dogs lay quietly beside narrow roads. The Nile moved slowly nearby. Even in darkness, the river never fully slept. Gentle water brushed against wooden boats tied beside the shore. Reeds swayed lightly at the riverbanks. Somewhere far across the water, a single bird called once into the quiet night before falling silent again. The air felt strange that morning. Older people sometimes noticed these things before others did. A certain heaviness moved through the wind. The desert carried a dry scent from far away. Sandstorms often arrived slowly at first. They did not always announce themselves with violence. Sometimes they came quietly, almost patiently, as though the desert itself were stretching awake. Inside one small home near the river, a baker named Hori opened his eyes before dawn. He lay still for a few moments listening to the silence around him. Beside him, his wife continued sleeping with one arm resting across their youngest child. The room smelled faintly of flour and old smoke from the cooking fire. Hori rubbed his tired eyes and sat up slowly, careful not to wake the others. His knees hurt from many years standing beside hot ovens. He reached for his sandals and stepped onto the cool floor. Outside, the sky remained dark blue, though a faint pale color had begun to rise low in the east. Hori opened the wooden door carefully and stepped into the narrow street between homes. The village felt calm and empty. A few other early workers already moved through the darkness carrying tools or baskets. One woman walked slowly toward the river with clay jars balanced carefully against her sides. Somewhere nearby, a donkey shifted quietly in its sleep. Hori paused. He looked toward the desert beyond the fields. The horizon appeared hazy even before sunrise. He narrowed his eyes but said nothing. Sandstorms were common enough that people learned to read small signs in the air. Sometimes the storms passed quickly. Sometimes they lasted for many hours and covered entire villages beneath drifting dust. For now, the world remained quiet. Hori continued toward the bakery near the center of the village. The building was simple and warm inside even before the fires were lit. Other bakers were already there grinding grain beneath low oil lamps. The sound of stone wheels turning against grain filled the room with a soft, steady rhythm. No one spoke very loudly at this hour. One young worker yawned while kneading dough inside a shallow clay bowl. Another slowly arranged dry fuel beneath the ovens. Dust floated gently through thin beams of lamplight. Hori washed his hands with cool water from a clay jar before beginning his work. He pressed dough carefully against a flat stone surface. His movements were slow and practiced from years of repetition. Outside, the first traces of sunrise slowly touched the village walls with pale gold light. The morning should have felt fresh. Instead, the air already carried warmth. As the sun rose higher, more villagers woke and stepped into the streets. Farmers prepared tools for the fields. Scribes wrapped rolls of papyrus inside linen cloth. Children carried baskets beside their parents. Merchants opened wooden shutters and arranged jars, woven cloth, dried fish, and pottery near the roads. But the wind kept changing. It grew drier as the morning passed. Fine dust began moving through the village in thin streams along the ground. Palm leaves rustled more sharply overhead. The river boats tied beside the shore rocked gently against their ropes. An old fisherman standing near the water spat quietly into the reeds. "Sandstorm," he muttered softly to himself. He had seen many before. The fishermen usually noticed changes in the weather quickly because they spent long hours outside beneath open skies. This man, whose name was Painasy, watched the eastern horizon carefully while repairing a fishing net with rough hands. The sky there had begun to lose its clear morning color. A pale wall of dust rested low in the distance. Not close yet, but coming. Painasy continued repairing his net anyway. Life beside the Nile rarely stopped completely for weather. People adjusted their routines. They waited. They rested indoors when necessary. They protected food and water from blowing sand. Then, when the storm passed, they returned to work again. Such things were part of ordinary life. By mid-morning, the wind strengthened. Dust swirled through the roads between homes. Merchants covered baskets with cloth. Mothers called children indoors. Workers walking toward nearby stone quarries wrapped linen around their mouths and noses. The sunlight itself began changing. Instead of bright gold, the world slowly turned pale and muted beneath drifting sand. Shadows softened. Distant objects disappeared behind a thin brown haze. Inside the bakery, Hori wiped sweat from his forehead while placing flat rounds of bread into the oven. The room had become hotter than usual. The ovens glowed red beneath the growing heat outside. Fine grains of sand drifted through cracks around the doorway. One younger baker coughed softly while brushing dust from the dough. "Close the shutters more," Hori said quietly. The young man nodded. Outside, the village no longer sounded peaceful. Wind moved through narrow streets with a low rushing sound. Palm branches rattled sharply. Loose cloth snapped against walls. Goats cried nervously from small pens behind houses. Yet even now, life continued. Near the riverbanks, women still washed clothing against smooth stones. Farmers still checked irrigation channels carrying water into fields of barley and vegetables. Scribes still sat cross-legged beneath shaded areas recording grain counts and deliveries for local officials. Ancient Egypt depended deeply on routine. People measured life through repeated tasks. Bread had to be baked. Water had to be carried. Animals needed feeding. Fishing nets needed repair. Sandstorms interrupted these things, but only for a while. The rhythm always returned. By noon, the storm finally arrived fully. The sky darkened strangely. Not with rain clouds, but with dust. The desert wind roared across the land carrying huge waves of sand through the air. Villages disappeared beneath moving clouds of brown and gold. Sunlight faded until midday looked almost like evening. Doors slammed shut. People hurried indoors. Workers covered their faces with linen and bent low against the wind while rushing home. Boats near the shore creaked violently against wooden poles. Sand hissed across walls and rooftops like flowing water. Inside homes, families gathered together quietly. Children pressed close to parents while dust rattled softly against reed-covered windows. Some people lit small oil lamps because the storm darkened the room so heavily. The air smelled dry and earthy. Tiny grains of sand settled across floors, blankets, and cooking bowls no matter how carefully doors were sealed. Hori sat beside his family after carrying extra bread home from the bakery. His youngest daughter watched the storm through a small crack near the doorway. "Will it last long?" she whispered. "Maybe until night," Hori replied softly. The child nodded sleepily. Storm days changed the rhythm of life. Work slowed. Conversations grew quieter. Many people simply waited indoors listening to the wind for hours. And so the long passing of time began. For ancient Egyptians, sandstorms created strange pauses in ordinary life. The outside world became difficult to cross. Roads disappeared beneath blowing dust. Boats avoided traveling when visibility became poor. Workers could not labor properly in open fields or construction sites. People turned inward instead. Families rested. Neighbors gathered together. Stories were told quietly beneath dim light. Some households played small games using carved stones or pieces of painted wood. Others repaired clothing, braided rope, prepared food, or simply slept while the storm continued outside. In Hori's home, his wife prepared a simple midday meal while the wind roared beyond the walls. She mixed lentils inside a clay pot with onions and herbs. The smell slowly filled the small room. Hori sat nearby mending worn leather straps from his sandals while his older son shaped small figures from leftover mud near the doorway. The storm made the room feel smaller and closer. Dust gathered in corners despite their efforts to keep it out. The oil lamp flickered gently. Occasionally the house trembled slightly beneath stronger gusts of wind. Yet there was comfort here too. No one expected heavy labor during the worst hours of a sandstorm. Bodies tired from constant work finally rested. Muscles loosened. Feet recovered from walking hard roads beneath the heat. Even the village itself seemed to pause. Farther north along the Nile, in a larger town beside busy trading routes, a group of scribes sat together inside a government storage building while dust blew outside. Normally they spent long hours counting grain sacks, recording taxes, and organizing shipments arriving by riverboat. But the storm had delayed most travel that day. Boats remained tied near shore waiting for clearer skies. The scribes now sat quietly on woven mats beside low tables. One older scribe slowly sharpened reed pens with a small knife. Another carefully copied lines from older records onto fresh papyrus while trying to keep sand from settling into wet ink. The youngest among them struggled to stay awake. His head dipped lower and lower until another scribe smiled faintly and nudged his shoulder. "You were awake too late," the older man murmured. The young scribe rubbed his eyes. Outside, the storm wind moaned softly through cracks in the building walls. Dust tapped gently against wooden shutters. The older scribes had experienced many such days. They understood the strange sleepy feeling that often came during sandstorms. The dim light, the heavy air, and the constant sound of wind could make entire afternoons feel distant and unreal. Some people even welcomed these storms quietly. Not because they were pleasant, but because they forced rest upon a world built around endless labor. Farmers paused their digging. Builders laid down heavy stones. Boatmen stopped rowing. The desert itself seemed to demand silence for a little while. Near the western desert cliffs, workers building tombs for wealthy officials sheltered inside unfinished chambers carved into stone. They sat together on the floor sharing bread, dried fish, and watered beer while dust drifted through the entrance tunnels. Their bodies ached from difficult labor. Each day they carved hard rock beneath intense heat using copper tools and wooden mallets. Their hands blistered. Their shoulders stiffened. Fine stone dust coated their skin and lungs. Now the sandstorm outside covered the cliffs entirely. One worker leaned against the wall and closed his eyes while listening to the wind echo faintly through the tomb passages. Another slowly rubbed oil into cracked hands. A third man began speaking quietly about his village beside the Nile far to the south. He described palm trees near the water and the smell of bread baking at sunrise. His voice remained low and calm while the others listened silently. Storm days often brought memories. The slowing of work allowed thoughts to wander. Some workers thought about family members waiting at home. Others remembered cooler evenings beside the river after harvest seasons. Older laborers remembered storms from childhood long ago. Time moved differently during these hours. The outside world vanished behind dust, and people settled deeper into small indoor spaces lit by weak lamps and filtered sunlight. As afternoon continued, the storm grew even thicker. In many villages, people could barely see beyond nearby walls. Sand piled against doorways. Animals huddled together quietly beneath shelter roofs. The air became difficult to breathe outdoors. Inside homes, the heat slowly built. Without fresh air moving through windows, rooms became warm and close. Sweat gathered on skin even while people rested motionless. Clay water jars remained cool for only a little while before warming slowly beneath the heavy air. Still, families adapted patiently. A grandmother in one riverside home quietly braided her granddaughter's hair while humming an old song almost too softly to hear. Nearby, two brothers scratched game patterns into the dirt floor using small stones. Their father slept deeply beside the wall after many exhausting days carrying limestone blocks beneath the sun. In another home, a young mother rocked a restless baby while whispering gentle words. Her older children sat beside the doorway listening to the wind outside. Occasionally they asked when the storm would end. Soon, she always answered softly. Though no one truly knew. At the edge of one village, a blind harp player sat inside a neighbor's home with several others gathered around him. Travel had become impossible during the storm, so he remained there waiting for calmer skies. As darkness slowly approached, he reached gently for his instrument. The room quieted. His fingers moved softly across the strings. The music blended with the distant sound of wind outside. Slow notes drifted through the dim room like moving water. Children leaned sleepily against their mothers. An old fisherman closed his eyes while listening. No one spoke for a long time. The storm continued. Sand moved endlessly across the desert beyond the village walls. The Nile itself became difficult to see beneath the thick dusty air. Boats rocked quietly beside empty riverbanks. Yet life remained warm within the homes. Meals were shared slowly. Stories passed from one generation to another. People rested sore bodies and waited patiently for the world outside to clear again. Night finally arrived almost unnoticed because the storm had already darkened the sky for hours. Oil lamps glowed softly inside houses across the villages beside the Nile. Their small flames flickered against mud-brick walls while the wind continued outside. The evening meal often became the calmest moment of storm days. Families gathered close together on mats while eating bread, lentils, onions, figs, or dried fish. The smell of warm food mixed with dust and lamp smoke. Tired workers stretched aching legs and spoke quietly about small things. No one rushed. There was nowhere to go. The roads outside remained buried beneath moving sand. In Hori's home, the children slowly grew sleepy while listening to the storm. His wife cleaned bowls carefully using precious water from a clay jar. Hori sat near the doorway watching faint dust move beneath the lamplight. He had lived through many sandstorms. As a child, they frightened him. The roaring wind had seemed endless then. But years of work and age changed such feelings. Now the storm simply felt like another part of life beside the desert. Sometimes harsh. Sometimes strangely peaceful. He listened to the sound carefully. The wind had begun weakening little by little. Not finished yet, but softer now. Around the village, others noticed the same thing. Doors opened slightly. People stepped outside briefly to test the air before retreating indoors again. Dust still moved through the darkness, but the violent gusts had slowed. The storm was growing tired. Deep into the night, silence slowly returned to the Nile. One by one, lamps dimmed inside homes. Families lay down together beneath thin linen sheets. Children slept quickly after long quiet hours indoors. Workers closed sore eyes while wind whispered faintly beyond the walls. Outside, sand still drifted softly across roads and rooftops. The desert remained awake. But the people beside the Nile rested at last within the warm darkness of their homes, waiting for another sunrise over ancient Egypt. Before dawn returned, the storm still lingered softly across the land. The great walls of dust that had darkened the day were gone now, but the air remained heavy with drifting sand. Fine grains moved quietly along the ground outside the sleeping villages. Palm leaves trembled gently beneath weak winds from the desert. The Nile flowed onward beneath a pale night sky where only a few stars could still be seen through the dusty air. Inside the homes beside the river, people slept deeply. The long storm had slowed everything. Bodies worn from labor welcomed the unexpected hours of stillness. Men who spent their days carrying stone or pulling fishing nets rested heavily on woven mats. Women whose hands were always busy grinding grain, weaving cloth, carrying water, or tending fires finally lay still in the darkness. Even restless children seemed quieter after the strange dim day spent indoors listening to the wind. The world felt muted. The desert had covered everything in a thin layer of dust. Sand rested on rooftops, window sills, baskets, sandals, and sleeping animals. It gathered in corners of rooms and inside folds of linen clothing. The ancient Egyptians understood this well. No matter how carefully doors were sealed or windows covered, the desert always found a way inside. Near the edge of one farming village, an elderly farmer named Mena woke before sunrise. His back ached before he even sat upright. For many years he had worked small fields near the Nile with his sons. Their family grew barley, onions, beans, and lettuce in dark fertile soil left behind after the river floods. The work demanded constant attention. Water channels had to remain clear. Crops needed watching beneath the heavy heat. Animals wandered if fences weakened. Days passed through endless repetition. But storms interrupted these routines. Mena sat quietly for a while listening to the faint wind outside his home. Beside him, his wife remained asleep beneath a thin cloth. He rubbed his rough hands slowly together before standing. The room smelled faintly of dust and old fire ash. He stepped outside into cool early morning air. The village remained mostly silent. A few lanterns glowed weakly behind reed-covered windows. Donkeys shifted beside wooden posts. Somewhere nearby, a rooster called uncertainly into the dimness. Mena looked toward the desert. The horizon appeared blurred but calmer now. The storm had nearly passed. He bent down and scooped a handful of sand from the ground beside his doorway. The grain slipped quietly through his fingers. During storms, the desert traveled far beyond its usual borders. Sand crossed roads, fields, gardens, and courtyards. By morning, many people would spend hours sweeping homes and clearing paths again. Still, Mena did not seem annoyed. He simply sighed softly and began his day. He walked slowly toward the river carrying 2 empty clay jars balanced across a wooden pole resting on his shoulders. The ground beneath his sandals felt cool after the long dark hours of night. Fine dust shifted beneath each step. As he neared the Nile, the smell of fresh water slowly replaced the dry scent of sand. The river looked quiet beneath the pale sky. A few fishermen were already awake beside their boats. They moved slowly, speaking little while checking ropes and nets. One younger fisherman rubbed sleep from his eyes while staring across the drifting mist above the water. Mena filled his jars carefully. Nearby, an older fisherman named Jiddu sat repairing part of a torn net damaged during the storm. Sandstorms could be difficult for fishermen. Wind pushed boats dangerously against riverbanks. Dust filled eyes and mouths. Nets became tangled with debris carried across the water. Still, the river people adapted just like everyone else. Jiddu nodded quietly toward Mena. "The air feels lighter today," he murmured. Mena nodded back. "Maybe by noon the sky will clear." The 2 men stood silently for a moment listening to gentle water moving against reeds. Then each returned slowly to his work. As dawn spread across the Nile Valley, soft light revealed the storm's traces everywhere. Sand covered the roads between homes. Palm trees leaned beneath dusty leaves. Market stalls stood empty beneath cloth coverings coated in brown powder. Clay jars left outdoors had nearly disappeared beneath drifting sand gathered around their bases. The world looked faded and quiet. In larger towns farther along the river, servants swept courtyards before sunrise while wealthy households slowly woke behind tall walls. Dust covered polished furniture and painted floors. Linen curtains hung heavy with fine sand. Young servants carried buckets of water while older workers beat dust from rugs outside. Even in grand homes, storms entered eventually. Inside one large estate belonging to a government official, a young servant girl named Tia hurried quietly through dim hallways carrying fresh water jars. Her feet moved silently across smooth stone floors still dusty from the storm. She had been awake since the darkest hours before dawn. Servants rarely rested long, even during storms. There was always cleaning to finish, meals to prepare, lamps to refill, floors to sweep, animals to feed. Tia entered an open courtyard where several servants were already brushing sand away from the stone pavement using bundles of reeds. Dust rose softly into the morning air with every movement. One older servant paused to stretch his stiff shoulders. "The desert visited us heavily yesterday," he muttered. No one answered. The work continued quietly. Beyond the estate walls, the town itself slowly returned to life. Bakers reopened ovens. Merchants uncovered goods. Children wandered into the streets again after long hours trapped indoors. Dogs barked softly while chasing one another through narrow dusty roads. The smell of bread slowly filled the morning air. Inside his bakery, Hori had already begun kneading fresh dough. The storm had delayed many things, but hunger never waited. Villagers arrived early hoping to buy warm bread before returning to work in fields or workshops. Dust still coated the doorway and window ledges, but the ovens burned brightly once more. Hori worked slowly but steadily. His arms ached from years beside the heat. The skin on his hands remained rough and cracked from flour, labor, and fire. Yet there was something comforting in the familiar rhythm of baking after the strange stillness of the storm. Outside, sunlight gradually strengthened. The sky remained hazy, though hints of clear blue slowly appeared above the Nile. People emerged carefully back into ordinary life. Farmers walked toward fields carrying hoes across their shoulders. Builders returned to unfinished walls and stone blocks. Scribes opened storage rooms and unrolled papyrus records. Boatmen pushed small wooden vessels back into the river current. Ancient Egypt moved once again through routine. But storms always left behind a slower mood for a little while. The heavy air and dim light lingered in people's bodies. Workers spoke more quietly the day after a storm. Movements remained slower beneath lingering exhaustion. Some people developed coughs from breathing dust for many hours. Others rubbed sore eyes irritated by blowing sand. Near the edge of the village, several women gathered together beside grinding stones beneath a shaded roof. Large baskets of grain rested nearby. Normally their work carried a steady rhythm of conversation, laughter, and movement. But this morning felt softer. The women turned heavy grinding stones slowly while speaking in calm low voices. One younger woman described how frightened her smallest child had become during the loudest part of the storm. Another quietly mentioned sand leaking through every crack in her home no matter how carefully she sealed the windows. An older woman simply smiled. "The desert always enters when it wishes," she said softly. The others nodded. They all understood. Dust and sand were not strangers here. They shaped daily life as surely as the Nile itself. Children grew up with sand between their toes and dust settling onto their skin each afternoon. Workers wrapped cloth around their faces beneath strong winds. Housewives swept floors endlessly. Travelers crossed roads buried overnight beneath drifting dunes. The desert was both enemy and neighbor. As the day warmed, the heat slowly returned. The brief coolness left behind by the storm faded beneath the rising sun. Villagers wiped sweat from their necks while working outdoors again. Dust still drifted lightly through the air, glowing gold beneath sunlight. Along the Nile, fishermen pushed narrow boats into the water once more. Painasi, the old fisherman who had first noticed the storm coming, stood near the riverbank adjusting a net over his shoulder. His face looked deeply lined from years beneath sun and wind. The river had shaped nearly his entire life. He stepped carefully into his small wooden boat while another younger fisherman untied the ropes. The Nile carried them slowly away from shore. Water lapped gently against the boat's sides. Reeds swayed quietly nearby. Birds circled above the river searching for fish beneath the morning light. For a while, neither man spoke. The silence felt peaceful after the endless sound of storm winds. Painasi dipped one hand briefly into the cool river water. Sandstorms often made people appreciate the Nile even more deeply afterward. The river brought life, moisture, food, and relief from the dry endless desert surrounding them. Without the Nile, there would be no villages here at all. Only sand. Farther south, workers repairing irrigation channels struggled beneath thick mud left near the water's edge. Storm winds had blown debris into several narrow canals feeding nearby farmland. Men climbed carefully into shallow trenches carrying baskets and wooden shovels. Their work felt slow beneath the growing heat. One worker wiped sweat from his face and stared toward the hazy desert horizon. "You can still taste the sand," he murmured. Another laughed softly. "You will taste it all summer." The men continued digging. The sound of scraping shovels blended with insects humming near the river reeds. Sweat darkened their linen clothing. Their shoulders burned beneath the sun. Yet even hard labor carried moments of quiet stillness. During short rests, the workers sat together beneath small shaded shelters made from reeds and cloth. They shared water and coarse bread while breathing slowly in the heavy afternoon heat. Dust still clung to their skin from the storm. One younger laborer closed his eyes briefly while leaning against a mud brick wall. He listened to distant sounds drifting across the fields. Birds calling. Water moving. Wind brushing through dry plants. Somewhere far away, faint hammering from a construction site. Ancient Egypt was full of such sounds. Not loud or hurried, but constant. Human labor echoed everywhere beside the Nile from sunrise until darkness. Grinding grain. Pulling nets. Hammering wood. Carving stone. Herding animals. Stirring cooking fires. Then storms arrived and interrupted everything for a little while. By late afternoon, much of the sky had finally cleared. Sunlight spread warm gold across the river banks again. Long shadows stretched beside homes and palm trees. Children played in the roads once more, their feet kicking up little clouds of lingering dust. The villages breathed easier now. Women hung washed linen outside to dry. Merchants reopened shaded stalls fully. Donkeys carried baskets of vegetables toward evening markets. Smoke rose gently from cooking fires as families prepared the night meal. In Hori's bakery, the final bread of the day cooled slowly on woven trays. The smell drifted warmly into the street outside. Hori's older son helped sweep sand from the floor while customers arrived carrying small baskets or jars for trade. Most people paid with grain, vegetables, fish, or labor rather than coins. Life moved through exchange and routine more than wealth. One old woman traded onions for a loaf still warm from the oven. Another customer brought dried dates. A fisherman exchanged part of the morning catch for several flat loaves wrapped carefully in cloth. The bakery felt warm and peaceful beneath the fading light. Outside, the heat finally began loosening its grip on the land. Evening along the Nile carried its own special calm after a sandstorm. The air cooled little by little. Dust settled slowly back to earth. The river reflected soft orange light beneath the setting sun. Workers returned home with tired steps after another long day. Many people bathed briefly near the river banks to wash dust from skin and hair. Children splashed quietly in shallow water while parents filled jars nearby. The smell of wet reeds and river mud mixed gently with smoke from evening fires drifting across the villages. Far away in the western desert, the last traces of the storm moved slowly onward across empty sands. The wind had grown tired again. Night approached softly. Families gathered indoors beneath oil lamps while darkness spread over the Nile Valley. The memory of the storm still lingered in conversation. People spoke quietly about how thick the dust had become or how loudly the wind had shaken the doors. Yet the fear had already faded. Storms were temporary. Life always returned afterward. In one small home near the river, Mena sat beside his family eating lentil stew from a shared clay bowl. His grandson rested sleepily against his shoulder while listening to the adults speak. Outside, the village sounded calm once more. Somewhere nearby, someone played a reed flute softly in the darkness. The music drifted gently between homes beneath the warm night air. Mena closed his tired eyes for a moment. Tomorrow would bring another long day of labor beneath the Egyptian sun. Fields would need tending. Water channels would need clearing. Animals would need care. Bread would need baking again before dawn. The endless rhythm would continue. But tonight, after the storm, the world beside the Nile felt quiet and soft beneath the stars. Long before the first light touched the Nile again, the villages beside the river rested beneath a deep and gentle darkness. The storm had passed almost completely now. Only a faint dryness remained in the air, along with thin layers of sand resting quietly over rooftops, palm leaves, and sleeping roads. The desert beyond the fertile valley seemed calm again beneath the pale stars. Far away, low dunes stretched endlessly beneath moonlight like silent waves frozen in place. Inside the mud-brick homes, families slept close together. The nights in ancient Egypt often brought relief after the long exhausting heat of day. Walls that had stored warmth beneath the sun slowly released it into the darkness. Open windows covered with woven reeds allowed cooler air to drip through the rooms. Oil lamps had burned low hours ago, leaving only faint moonlight to touch the floors. In one small riverside house, a fisherman named Kai slowly opened his eyes. For a few moments he remained still, listening. The village around him was nearly silent. Only the distant sound of insects and the soft movement of river water reached his ears. Beside him, his wife slept beneath a thin linen cloth while their young son lay curled nearby with one hand resting against a woven basket. Kai sat up carefully. His shoulders felt stiff from many years pulling heavy nets through the Nile. The muscles in his arms remained sore even after resting through the storm. Fine dust still coated the corners of the room despite repeated sweeping the previous day. He rubbed his eyes slowly and reached for his sandals. Fishermen often woke before almost everyone else. The Nile changed with the light, and early morning offered cooler air and calmer water. Kai quietly stepped outside carrying a folded fishing net over one shoulder. The village rested beneath deep blue darkness. Only a few other workers were awake. A baker walked silently toward his ovens carrying bundles of dry reeds for fuel. Two women moved slowly toward the river with empty jars balanced against their hips. Somewhere farther down the road, a donkey snorted softly while shifting beside a wooden fence. Kai began walking toward the riverbank. The air smelled clean again after the storm. Not fully free of dust, but softer now. The sharp scent of dry sand had faded beneath the cool moisture drifting from the Nile. Above him, the stars slowly dimmed as the eastern horizon began turning pale gray. The river appeared almost black beneath the fading night. Several small fishing boats rested quietly near shore. Kai stepped carefully into his own narrow wooden vessel and untied the rope holding it beside a post driven deep into the mud. The boat rocked gently beneath him. For a moment he simply sat there listening to the water. These quiet hours before sunrise often felt sacred to working people beside the Nile. The world had not yet fully awakened. The heat remained distant. Even the birds were still silent. Only the river moved. Kai pushed the boat slowly away from shore using a long wooden pole. Ripples spread softly across the dark water behind him. Nearby, other fishermen began doing the same, their small boats drifting quietly through the mist rising above the Nile. No one spoke loudly. There was no need. The calmness of early morning seemed to ask for silence. As the first light appeared, the world slowly revealed itself again. Palm trees emerged from the darkness one by one. Mud brick homes along the riverbanks glowed faintly gold beneath dawn light. Thin smoke rose from cooking fires where the earliest workers prepared food before labor began. Kai cast his net carefully into the river. The movement felt practiced and smooth after years of repetition. The weighted edges spread wide across the water before sinking beneath the surface. Then he waited quietly. Fishing required patience more than speed. Hours often passed slowly upon the river beneath sun and wind. Fishermen learned to accept long silences. They watched birds circle overhead. They studied small movements in the water. They listened to reeds brushing gently along the banks. Kai looked toward the desert cliffs far beyond the fertile valley. Even from here, he could still see faint traces of dust hanging low against the horizon from yesterday's storm. The desert never truly rested. It waited patiently beyond the green ribbon of Nile life. Back in the village, more people slowly began waking. Doors opened one by one. The sound of sweeping filled the roads as women brushed sand away from entrances and courtyards. Children rubbed sleep from their eyes while helping carry water jars. Bakers relit ovens before sunrise fully arrived. The smell of bread slowly spread through the cool morning air. Inside Hori's bakery, the heat already built steadily. The ovens glowed orange while dough rested beneath linen cloths on stone tables. Young workers moved sleepily through drifting flour dust while preparing the first bread of the day. Hori himself stood near the ovens shaping flat rounds of dough with strong practiced hands. He had worked nearly every morning this way since childhood. Some mornings felt harder than others. His knees often hurt badly before sunrise. Heat from the ovens made breathing difficult during summer months. Yet the routine itself carried a strange comfort. The movements no longer required thought. His body understood the work even while half asleep. Outside, the village brightened slowly beneath the rising sun. Birds began calling from palm trees near the river. Goats bleated softly from small pens beside homes. Farmers carrying tools walked toward the fields in groups along dusty roads. The storm already felt farther away now. Only the thin sand covering everything remained as proof. Near the center of the village, an old woman named Nebet sat outside her home grinding grain beneath the morning light. Her hands moved steadily against the heavy grinding stone while dust rose softly around her feet. Beside her sat her granddaughter, still sleepy from waking early. The child traced patterns in the sand with a small stick while watching the village come alive around them. "Did the storms happen when you were little too?" the girl asked quietly. Nebet smiled faintly without stopping her work. "Yes," she answered softly. "Many storms." The child looked toward the desert. "Were they frightening?" Nebet paused for a moment. "When I was young, yes. But after many years, the storms become part of life. Like heat. Like the river floods. Like the wind." The girl nodded thoughtfully, though she only partly understood. Children in ancient Egypt grew up learning that life moved according to forces larger than themselves. The Nile flooded when it wished. Crops failed sometimes. Heat exhausted the body. Sandstorms arrived without asking permission. People survived through patience more than control. As morning deepened, the sunlight grew stronger. Workers wiped sweat from their faces while continuing daily labor beneath the warming sky. Along the riverbanks, women washed clothing against smooth stones while speaking softly together. The wet cloth slapped rhythmically against the rocks beside flowing water. Nearby, children splashed barefoot at the edge of the Nile before being called back by tired mothers. Life beside the river always carried movement. Yet the movement rarely felt rushed. Tasks unfolded slowly across the day beneath the weight of heat and repetition. Farther north, near a busy town filled with workshops and storage buildings, craftsmen returned fully to work after the storm. Inside one pottery workshop, several men shaped wet clay beneath shaded roofing made from reeds and wood. Their hands moved carefully while spinning simple pottery wheels. Clay jars, bowls, and storage containers lined the walls, drying in rows. The room smelled cool and earthy. One potter dipped his hands into water before pressing fresh clay carefully between his palms. Another used a thin cord to cut finished vessels from spinning wheels. The storm had delayed several deliveries, leaving extra work waiting today. Still, no one hurried. The heavy heat already settling over the town made fast movement impossible. Sweat rolled slowly down the workers' necks while flies drifted lazily through warm air. Outside, donkeys carrying goods passed along dusty roads toward the markets. A young apprentice near the entrance struggled to shape a straight clay bowl. His hands trembled slightly with frustration. An older potter watched quietly before finally stepping closer. Slowly, the older man murmured. He guided the apprentice's fingers gently against the spinning clay. The clay remembers rough hands. The young apprentice nodded. The bowl slowly steadied beneath his touch. Such quiet teaching happened everywhere in ancient Egypt. Skills passed from older hands to younger ones through long repetition rather than written instruction. Bakers trained sons. Fishermen taught nephews. Stone workers guided apprentices beneath the hot sun year after year. Life unfolded through routine carried across generations. By midday, the heat became heavy once more. The coolness left behind by the storm disappeared beneath harsh sunlight pouring across the valley. The sand covering roads and rooftops reflected light back into the air, making everything feel brighter and hotter. Workers slowed beneath the heat. Farmers rested briefly beneath palm shade beside irrigation channels. Fishermen pulled boats toward shore to escape the strongest sun. Merchants covered their heads with linen cloth while sitting beside market stalls. Even animals sought shade. Dogs slept beneath carts. Donkeys stood motionless beside walls with half-closed eyes. Birds hid among reeds near the riverbanks. The world itself seemed tired. Inside many homes, afternoon meals were prepared quietly while the heat pressed heavily against the mud brick walls. Women stirred lentils over small fires. Flat bread cooled on woven trays. Clay jars of water rested in shaded corners where the air remained slightly cooler. Children often grew sleepy during these hours. The heat wrapped around the villages like a blanket. Conversations softened. Movements slowed. Even sounds seemed distant beneath the bright afternoon sky. In one crowded home near the edge of town, a group of workers rested together after repairing a damaged storage building roof earlier that morning. Their bodies ached from lifting heavy wooden beams beneath the rising heat. One man stretched out against the floor and closed his eyes immediately. Another slowly massaged sore muscles in his forearms. A younger laborer sat near the doorway eating onions and bread while staring quietly outside. Dust still drifted through the streets beyond. Not from storms now, but from ordinary life. Sandals scraping roads. Donkeys carrying loads. Workers moving stone and grain beneath the sun. The younger laborer watched two children chase one another through the dusty road before disappearing between homes. Then he leaned his head back against the wall and drifted into sleep. Afternoon naps were common whenever labor allowed them. The heat demanded rest. People in ancient Egypt understood their bodies well because survival depended on endurance. Workers who ignored exhaustion became sick more easily. Farmers weakened beneath the sun. Builders collapsed from heat. Boatmen lost strength rowing against river currents. Rest mattered deeply in such a climate. As the afternoon slowly passed, the light softened little by little. Long shadows stretched once more across the roads. The worst heat began loosening its grip on the valley. Workers returned gradually to unfinished tasks while cooler breezes drifted from the river. Along the Nile, Kai and the other fishermen returned with their catch. The boats moved slowly toward shore heavy with fish glistening silver beneath the lowering sun. Children waited excitedly near the riverbanks while women prepared baskets for sorting the catch. Kai stepped carefully from his boat onto the muddy shore. His arms felt heavy with fatigue. Still, the sight of the quiet river beneath evening light calmed him deeply. The Nile reflected gold and orange colors from the sky above. Reeds swayed softly in the evening breeze. Birds crossed low over the water searching for food before nightfall. Nearby, several older fishermen sat together repairing nets once more. Their hands worked automatically while conversation drifted slowly between them. One spoke about a storm he remembered from childhood that lasted nearly 3 days. Another described boats nearly lost in violent winds years earlier. The youngest among them listened quietly while mending torn rope. The stories moved slowly like the river itself. Nothing dramatic. Only memories carried gently through tired voices beneath the evening sky. As darkness approached again, cooking fires brightened across the villages beside the Nile. The smell of roasting fish, bread, onions, and herbs filled the cooling air. Families gathered together after another long day beneath sun and dust. The storm had already become yesterday's memory. Yet its quiet pause still lingered inside people. Perhaps that was why evenings after storms often felt softer than usual. People spoke more gently. Children stayed close beside parents. Workers rested more deeply. The desert beyond the valley remained vast and endless beneath the fading light, but beside the Nile, warm lamps glowed softly within mud-brick homes while the ancient world settled once more into darkness and sleep. During the deepest hours of night, the Nile Valley became almost completely silent. The long roads between villages rested beneath pale moonlight. Palm trees stood motionless against the sky. Even the desert winds seemed to sleep for a little while after many restless days. Only the river continued moving steadily through darkness, brushing softly against reeds and wooden boats tied along the shore. Inside the homes beside the Nile, tired workers shifted quietly in their sleep. Some dreamed deeply after long hours beneath the heat. Others woke briefly during the night, listening to distant dogs barking or to the faint sound of insects outside the windows. The air inside the mud-brick homes felt warm but calmer now. The heavy dust from the storm had settled little by little onto floors and rooftops. In one small village south of Memphis, a young mother named Izette sat awake beside a low oil lamp while the rest of her family slept. Her smallest child had developed a cough after breathing too much sand during the storm. The little boy rested against her chest beneath a thin linen cloth while she gently rubbed his back. The lamp flickered softly beside them. Outside, the darkness felt deep and endless. Izette looked toward the doorway where faint moonlight touched the floor. She could hear the Nile somewhere beyond the sleeping homes. The sound was distant but comforting. Many people beside the river felt safest at night when they could hear the water. The Nile brought life into a difficult world of heat, dryness, and endless labor. Even during storms, people trusted the river to remain beside them, flowing patiently through the valley as it always had. The little boy coughed softly again. Izette reached for a clay cup filled with cool water and touched it gently to his lips. Nearby, her husband slept heavily after another exhausting day repairing irrigation walls damaged during the storm. His hands remained swollen from labor. Small cuts crossed his fingers where rough stones had scraped the skin. The ancient world was filled with tired bodies. Nearly everyone carried some form of physical pain. Farmers bent over fields until their backs stiffened with age. Bakers stood beside hot ovens until their knees weakened. Fishermen pulled heavy nets through the river until their shoulders burned constantly. Life beside the Nile demanded endurance more than comfort. Yet people still found moments of softness within that hard life. Izette hummed quietly beneath her breath while holding the child close. The melody was slow and simple. Her own mother had sung the same tune long ago during sleepless nights beside cooking fires and dim lamps. The child slowly relaxed against her chest. Outside, somewhere far across the village, a donkey brayed softly into the darkness before falling silent again. Hours passed slowly. At last, the little boy's breathing steadied. Izette carefully lowered him onto a woven mat beside his older brother. Then she moved quietly toward the doorway and stepped outside for a moment beneath the night sky. The air felt cooler now. Moonlight rested softly over the village roads still dusted with sand from the storm. Clay walls glowed pale beneath the stars. Nearby palm leaves rustled gently in a faint breeze drifting from the river. Izette closed her tired eyes briefly. The silence felt peaceful after the busy heat of day. Night offered rare stillness in ancient Egypt. Labor finally paused. Markets emptied. Boats rested quietly along the shore. Tools were set aside until dawn. Only guards, fishermen, bakers, and a few servants remained awake through most of the darkness. Farther north along the Nile, near a large temple complex surrounded by towering stone walls, several priests moved silently through shadowed halls lit by oil lamps. Their white linen garments brushed softly against smooth stone floors. The storm had coated even the temple courtyards with fine dust. Earlier in the evening, young temple servants spent hours sweeping sand from statues, stairways, and sacred rooms before darkness fully arrived. Now the temple stood calm again. The priests worked quietly, tending lamps and preparing offerings for the coming sunrise rituals. The smell of incense drifted gently through the cool stone chambers. One elderly priest paused beside an open courtyard and looked upward toward the moon. The storm clouds and dust had finally cleared almost completely. The stars appeared sharp again above the desert cliffs. For a long moment he simply listened to the night. Even in places devoted to ceremony and gods, ordinary rhythms shaped life. Priests became tired. Servants developed sore feet from carrying water and sweeping floors. Young apprentices struggled to remain awake during long rituals before dawn. Ancient Egypt often appeared grand from a distance, with massive temples and towering monuments rising above the land. But inside those places lived ordinary human beings moving through simple routines day after day. The old priest turned and continued slowly down the hallway. His sandals whispered softly against stone. Beyond the temple walls, the sleeping city stretched quietly beside the river. Wealthy homes rested behind enclosed courtyards while crowded neighborhoods of workers and craftsmen lay close together along narrow dusty streets. Somewhere in the darkness, a baby cried briefly. A dog barked. Then silence returned again. Near the riverbank, several night fishermen prepared small fires beside their boats while waiting for the cooler hours before dawn. They sat together beneath the stars mending nets and speaking in low tired voices. The youngest among them yawned repeatedly while trying to stay awake. One older fisherman smiled faintly. "You worked too hard yesterday," he murmured. The younger man rubbed his eyes. "The storm made everyone tired." The others nodded quietly. Sandstorms exhausted entire villages. Dust irritated lungs and eyes. The strange dim light during storms often disrupted sleep. Heat trapped indoors made rest difficult. Even after the winds faded, people carried lingering heaviness in their bodies for days. The fishermen shared bread and dried fish beside the small fire. Its glow reflected softly across the nearby water. Around them, the Nile moved silently through darkness. Hours later, the eastern horizon slowly began turning gray once more. Another day approached. The fishermen rose stiffly from the ground and prepared their boats while birds began calling faintly from the reeds. Cool morning air drifted across the riverbanks carrying the smell of water and wet earth. Across the valley, bakers woke before dawn again. Inside Hori's bakery, the first oven fires crackled softly while the village remained mostly asleep. The familiar routine returned exactly as it always did. Grain was ground beneath stone wheels. Dough was kneaded. Ash was swept aside from the ovens. Hori moved more slowly this morning. His back hurt badly from standing the previous day. He paused several times while lifting baskets of flour, pressing one hand against his lower spine before continuing. The younger workers noticed but said nothing. Everyone understood such pain eventually. One apprentice opened the shutters slightly to let cooler air inside. Outside, dawn slowly spread across the roads and rooftops. Thin layers of sand still rested along the village edges where the storm had piled them against walls and fences. Children would play in those little dunes later after chores were finished. For now, the village still belonged mostly to workers. A water carrier walked slowly through the streets balancing clay jars across his shoulders. Two farmers passed carrying wooden hoes toward the fields. An elderly woman swept sand from her doorway with careful, steady movements. The world awakened gently. As the sun rose higher, the valley warmed quickly. Morning coolness disappeared beneath growing heat. Workers wiped sweat from their necks before the day had fully begun. Donkeys carrying vegetables and grain moved along crowded roads toward nearby markets. Boatmen guided cargo vessels through the Nile current using large square sails catching the morning breeze. The storm already felt distant now. Yet its effects remained everywhere. Some irrigation channels still needed clearing where wind-blown sand had drifted into the water paths. Several fishing boats required repairs after rough waves pushed them against rocks during the storm. Merchants unpacked goods protected beneath heavy cloth coverings for 2 long days. Life returned piece by piece. Near the fields outside Mena's village, farmers worked quietly beside shallow canals carrying Nile water into rows of crops. The earth there smelled rich and damp beneath the sunlight. Mena himself stood barefoot in soft mud adjusting a small barrier of packed soil to guide water toward young barley plants. His sons worked farther down the field removing weeds and checking for damage caused by blowing sand. The labor felt endless sometimes. Water had to move carefully through the farmland. Too little and crops dried beneath the heat. Too much and roots weakened in the soil. The farmers bent low beneath the sun for hours. Sweat darkened their linen clothing. Mud coated their legs up to the knees. Flies drifted lazily around them while birds searched nearby fields for insects stirred from the soil. Still, there was peace in the rhythm. Mena paused for a moment and straightened slowly, pressing both hands against his aching back. He looked toward the Nile shimmering brightly nearby. Beyond it, the desert cliffs stood silent beneath the clear sky. The storm was gone now. Only sunlight remained. By midday, the heat grew intense once more across the valley. Workers sought shade whenever possible. Farmers rested briefly beneath palm trees near the canals. Craftsmen paused inside workshops to drink water from cool clay jars. Children hid indoors beside shaded walls while the strongest sunlight burned over the land. Inside one weaving workshop near a busy market town, several women sat cross-legged beside upright looms weaving linen cloth from flax fibers. Their fingers moved carefully through long threads stretched tight between wooden frames. The room felt warm and dusty. Light entered through narrow openings high in the walls, casting pale beams across drifting fibers floating in the air. One woman quietly spoke about the storm while continuing her work. "My roof almost lifted away," she murmured. Another smiled faintly. "At least the heat rested for one day." A few soft laughs followed. Then the steady rhythm of weaving filled the room again. The women worked hour after hour with practiced patience. Their backs often stiffened from sitting long periods beside the looms. Fingers cracked from dry fibers and rough labor. Yet their cloth traveled everywhere across Egypt, worn by workers, priests, merchants, and servants alike. Every object in the ancient world carried someone's labor within it. Bread came from aching backs in the fields. Boats came from carpenters sweating beside wood shavings. Fish came from rough hands pulling nets through water before sunrise. Nothing appeared easily. As afternoon slowly softened toward evening, long shadows stretched once more across the Nile Valley. The worst heat faded little by little. Children returned to the roads carrying sticks, chasing dogs, or helping parents gather water and firewood before darkness arrived. Market sellers packed away remaining goods beneath linen covers. Boatmen secured ropes along the shore. The sky turned warm gold above the river. Kai sat beside his boat repairing part of a torn net while watching the sunset reflect across the water. Nearby, his young son tried carefully copying the same nodding movements with clumsy fingers. Kai guided the boy patiently. "Not too tight," he said softly. The child nodded seriously and tried again. The net slowly took shape between their hands. Evening breezes moved gently through the reeds along the shore. Somewhere nearby, women laughed quietly while washing cooking bowls at the river's edge. The smell of roasting onions drifted from nearby homes. The world felt calm again. Storms came and went. Heat returned every day. People worked, rested, aged, and slept beside the Nile beneath endless skies of dust, sunlight, and stars. And slowly, as darkness settled once more across ancient Egypt, lamps glowed warmly inside mudbrick homes while the river carried its quiet waters through the peaceful night. The night deepened slowly over the Nile Valley. One by one, the last cooking fires faded into dim orange embers beside the homes. Voices disappeared from the roads. Market stalls stood empty beneath linen coverings gently moving in the cool breeze drifting from the river. Palm trees cast long dark shadows across the sleeping villages while stars spread quietly above the desert cliffs. The heat of the day still lingered inside the mud-brick walls. Families rested on woven mats with windows partly open to allow the night air inside. Some people slept immediately after long hours of labor. Others remained awake a little longer, speaking softly beside fading lamps while children drifted to sleep nearby. In one crowded workers' home near a stone quarry settlement, a young laborer named Beck sat quietly near the doorway rubbing oil into his sore hands. Tiny cuts crossed his palms from hauling rough limestone blocks earlier that day. Fine white stone dust still clung beneath his fingernails despite washing. His shoulders ached heavily whenever he moved. Across the room, several other workers already slept. They shared the small home together because the quarry lay far from their original villages beside the Nile. Most had left families behind months earlier to work near the cliffs cutting stone for temples, tombs, and government buildings farther north. The labor exhausted them completely. Days passed beneath brutal sunlight reflecting off pale rock walls. Men swung heavy tools hour after hour while supervisors shouted instructions through clouds of dust. Water grew warm quickly beneath the heat. Feet blistered inside rough sandals. Muscles stiffened before midday even arrived. Yet now, during the calm night, the quarry settlement rested quietly. The storm from earlier days had left thin sand drifts against the stone buildings and pathways. Workers spent much of the afternoon clearing them away before returning to hauling rock again. Beck flexed his aching fingers slowly. Outside, he could hear the faint sound of distant voices drifting from another sleeping house. Somewhere farther off, a donkey moved restlessly against its rope. The world felt very still. He leaned his head back against the wall and closed his eyes for a moment. His body wanted sleep immediately, but his hands throbbed too badly. Many laborers understood this feeling. Exhaustion and pain often lived together. People became so accustomed to discomfort that they rarely spoke about it. Sore backs, swollen knees, cracked skin, headaches from heat, coughing from dust, such things belonged naturally to life beside the Nile and desert. Beck finally lay down beside the others. The room smelled faintly of sweat, oil, dust, and old straw mats warmed by the day's heat. Within minutes, sleep slowly pulled him into darkness. Outside the quarry settlement, the desert stretched silently beneath the stars. Far away from the villages and fertile riverbanks, the empty sands carried their own strange beauty at night. Moonlight touched the dunes softly. Dry wind brushed across endless open ground. Ancient roads crossed the darkness between distant settlements and trading posts where travelers sometimes camped beneath the stars. Even during peaceful nights, small groups still moved through the desert. Merchants guided donkeys loaded with goods toward towns along the Nile. Messengers carried written orders between officials. Guards escorted shipments of stone, grain, or valuable materials. Travel during daylight often became unbearable beneath the heat, so many journeys continued during cooler nighttime hours instead. One small caravan moved slowly beneath the moonlight not far from the river. The animals walked patiently through drifting sand while their handlers kept cloth wrapped around their heads against the dry air. Lantern lights swayed gently beside the donkeys with each step. No one spoke much. The travelers were tired after many days on the road. Their water supplies had grown warm and low beneath the desert heat. Sand still covered their clothing from the recent storm. Yet the sight of distant Nile villages ahead brought quiet relief. Soon there would be wells, bread ovens, shaded courtyards, and river water again. The caravan leader looked toward the faint lights glowing far ahead near the riverbanks. Ancient Egypt often appeared calm and eternal from a distance, but movement never truly stopped. Boats drifted constantly along the Nile. Workers carried supplies between villages. Farmers traded grain for fish or pottery. Messengers traveled dusty roads carrying orders from officials and scribes. The entire world moved through labor. As the deepest hours of night passed, cooler air settled gently across the valley. Inside the villages, sleeping people shifted beneath thin linen sheets. Dogs curled beside walls. Fishing boats rocked quietly against their ropes near the shore. Then, slowly, the first signs of another morning began. A faint gray light appeared low in the east. Birds stirred among the reeds. Somewhere near the center of Hori's village, a rooster called sharply into the darkness. The ancient world awakened again. Inside the bakery, Hori rose before dawn as always. For a few moments he sat motionless on his mat, listening to the familiar sounds outside. The storm now felt far behind them, though traces of sand still lingered in every corner of village life. Beside him, his wife remained asleep while their youngest child breathed softly nearby. Hori stood slowly. His knees cracked painfully as he reached for his sandals. Age made mornings harder now. The coolness before sunrise often stiffened his joints after years standing beside hot ovens. Still, the routine pulled him forward. The village would soon need bread. Farmers expected food before entering the fields. Workers heading toward the quarries carried loaves wrapped in cloth for long days of labor. So Hori stepped outside once more into the pale darkness. The air smelled fresh beside the Nile. Not cool exactly, but softer than midday heat. Dust drifted quietly beneath his sandals while he walked toward the bakery carrying bundles of dry reeds for the oven fires. Other early workers already moved through the roads. A fisherman passed carrying folded nets over one shoulder. Two women walked toward the river with empty water jars balanced carefully against their hips. A young servant hurried through the village carrying a basket of vegetables toward a wealthy household. No one wasted words this early. Most people still carried sleep inside them. At the bakery, young apprentices rubbed their eyes while preparing grain and water for the morning dough. One boy yawned so widely that flour puffed softly into the air from his hands. Hori smiled faintly but said nothing. The oven soon glowed warm beneath flickering firelight. Outside, dawn slowly spread over the Nile Valley once more. The river turned pale gold beneath the rising sun. Reeds swayed gently along the banks. Mist drifted low above the water before slowly fading into the warming air. Fishermen pushed boats into the river. Farmers crossed dusty roads toward the fields. Children still slept inside many homes while mothers prepared the first meal of the day beside small cooking fires. The ancient rhythm continued without pause. Near Menace farmland, several workers already stood knee-deep in muddy irrigation channels repairing sections weakened during the storm. The work felt unpleasant even in early morning. Mud sucked heavily at their legs while insects hovered around their faces. Yet the fields depended on careful water flow. Without maintenance, crops could fail beneath the heat within days. Mena himself directed the work quietly. He pointed toward sections where sand had collapsed into the canals during the storm winds. Younger men used wooden shovels to clear the pathways while water slowly rushed past their legs. One worker wiped sweat from his forehead and looked toward the brightening sky. "It will be very hot today," he muttered. Mena nodded. The older farmer could already feel the heat building. Storms sometimes offered brief relief from the sun, but afterward the air often became even heavier. The damp smell of river mud mixed with growing warmth around them. Still, the farmers continued steadily. Ancient Egypt survived through such constant effort. Every loaf of bread, every woven cloth, every painted jar, every fishing net, every boat, every stone wall came from human hands working patiently through exhaustion, heat, dust, and time. As morning deepened, the villages fully awakened again. Smoke rose from hundreds of cooking fires. Children carried baskets beside parents through crowded roads. Donkeys loaded with vegetables, fish, grain, and pottery moved slowly toward busy marketplaces. Scribes unrolled papyrus documents inside storage buildings while merchants arranged goods beneath shaded stalls. Life spread outward like sunlight across the valley. Near one market close to the river, a group of musicians sat beneath a woven shade canopy playing softly while nearby merchants opened their stalls. The music drifted lazily through the warm morning air. A flute. A small harp. A quiet hand drum. Nothing loud or hurried. People in ancient Egypt often welcomed gentle music during ordinary routines. Songs accompanied grain grinding, rowing, weaving, and even long walks beside the Nile. The sounds softened difficult labor and filled empty moments during repetitive tasks. One elderly merchant arranging jars of oil smiled faintly while listening. The storm days had felt unusually quiet. Now the familiar sounds of ordinary life returned fully. Nearby, a young boy chased chickens through the dusty market road while his mother apologized tiredly to a vegetable seller. An old fisherman argued gently over the price of onions. Two donkeys refused stubbornly to move while their owner tugged impatiently at the ropes. Yet even busy moments carried softness here. The heat discouraged haste. Everything unfolded slowly beneath the Egyptian sun. By midday, the market became thick with warmth, dust, smells, and movement. The scent of baked bread mixed with fish, spices, sweat, smoke, and river mud. Merchants called quietly to passing customers beneath shaded cloth canopies. Flies drifted lazily through the air. Workers paused often to drink water from clay cups. The recent storm still lingered in small ways. Dust-coated baskets and sandals. Some merchants complained about delayed shipments arriving late by riverboat. Several potters worried about cracked clay drying unevenly after the strange humid winds. But already the storm itself was becoming memory. Ancient people rarely had the luxury of dwelling on yesterday for long. The next task always waited. Near the riverbank, Kai repaired part of his boat damaged slightly during rough storm waves. He crouched beside the wooden hull rubbing oil carefully into cracked sections while his son handed him tools. The boy looked toward the desert beyond the valley. "Will another storm come soon?" he asked quietly. Kai shrugged gently. "Maybe tomorrow. Maybe many days from now." The child frowned slightly. "How do you know when they are coming?" Kai paused. He looked toward the distant cliffs where faint heat shimmer already danced beneath the afternoon sun. "You feel it," he answered softly. "In the wind. In the air. In the silence." The boy considered this carefully. Then he nodded, though he did not fully understand yet. One day he would. Children beside the Nile learned slowly through seasons and repetition. They learned the smell of rain that almost never came. They learned how hot stone felt beneath bare feet at midday. They learned the sound of wind changing before a storm. The desert taught patience. As afternoon stretched toward evening once again, shadows slowly lengthened over the villages. The heat finally softened. Workers finished final tasks before darkness. Farmers guided animals home along dusty roads. Women prepared evening meals while children carried water jars from the river. Above the Nile, the sky turned warm orange and gold. Birds crossed slowly overhead toward nesting places among the reeds. And quietly, gently, beneath the fading sunlight, another peaceful night began settling over ancient Egypt. Evening settled softly across the Nile Valley like a slow breath. The fierce brightness of the afternoon sun faded little by little behind the western desert cliffs. Heat still rose from the roads and stone walls, but the sharp edge of the day had finally passed. Long shadows stretched beside palm trees and mudbrick homes while the river reflected warm bands of gold beneath the darkening sky. Workers returned home with tired bodies. Sandals scraped quietly against dusty roads. Donkeys carried empty baskets after long market hours. Farmers walked slowly from the fields with tools resting across sore shoulders. The smell of cooking fires began spreading gently through the villages once more. Ancient Egypt often felt calmest during these evening hours. Labor loosened its grip for a little while. The endless rhythm of work paused just enough for people to breathe, eat, wash dust from their skin, and sit together beneath the cooling air. Near the riverbank, Kai and his son finished securing their fishing boat beside a wooden post driven deep into the mud. The Nile moved softly around the hull while reeds brushed gently nearby. Kai's arms felt heavy after the long day. Fishing appeared peaceful from a distance, but the work demanded constant strength. Nets became soaked and heavy in the water. Boats required repairs almost endlessly beneath sun, sand, and river moisture. Long hours standing beneath open skies stiffened backs and burned skin dark beneath the heat. His son handed him a small clay cup of water. Kai drank slowly. The water tasted faintly of the river and the clay jar it came from. Still, it felt cool enough to ease some of the dryness in his throat. Nearby, several fishermen sat together mending torn nets while evening deepened around them. Their fingers moved carefully through rope and reed fiber with practiced patience. One older fisherman pointed quietly toward the desert horizon. A faint brown haze rested low in the distance again. Not another storm yet. Only drifting dust carried by evening winds far beyond the valley. Still, everyone noticed it. People beside the Nile rarely ignored the desert for long. Kai's son stared toward the haze thoughtfully. "Do storms begin out there?" he asked. The older fisherman beside them smiled faintly. "They begin farther away than you can imagine." The child remained quiet after that, watching the distant desert beneath the fading light. As darkness slowly approached, lamps began glowing inside homes across the villages. Women prepared simple evening meals over small fires. The smell of lentils, onions, herbs, and fresh bread drifted warmly through narrow roads. Children chased one another through dusty courtyards until tired parents called them indoors. Inside Hori's home, the baker sat cross-legged beside his family while his wife divided warm bread into small portions for supper. Their youngest daughter leaned sleepily against his shoulder. The long day had exhausted her. Hori himself felt deeply tired too. Heat from the bakery oven still clung to his skin hours after leaving work. His hands smelled faintly of smoke and flour. Yet evenings beside family brought quiet comfort. The room glowed softly beneath an oil lamp placed near the wall. Dust still lingered in corners despite many days of sweeping after the storm. Clay jars stood neatly beside woven baskets filled with onions and dried dates. Outside, someone nearby played a reed flute softly. The music drifted gently through the warm night air. Hori's older son listened quietly while chewing bread. "Do you remember the big storm when I was small?" the boy asked. Hori nodded slowly. "The one that covered the whole road to the river?" "Yes." His wife smiled faintly. "You cried because you thought the world had disappeared." The children laughed softly. The older son looked embarrassed but smiled too. Storms often became family memories passed gently through conversation during quiet evenings. People remembered doors shaking beneath violent winds. They remembered animals running loose through villages. They remembered strange afternoons when daylight disappeared beneath walls of dust. Yet these memories rarely carried drama. The storms belonged naturally to life. Outside the village, the Nile darkened beneath the rising stars. Boat lanterns glimmered faintly upon the water where a few fishermen still worked through the cooler night hours. Frogs croaked softly among reeds near the shore. The smell of wet mud drifted across the riverbanks. Farther north, inside a crowded city district near large temple grounds, nighttime life moved differently. The city never fully slept. Servants hurried through dim courtyards carrying water and food for wealthy households. Guards walked slowly along walls holding lamps against the darkness. Bakers prepared bread long before dawn while workers unloaded late shipments arriving by boat. In one narrow street lined with small homes and workshops, a linen weaver named Pasharanta sat outside his doorway enjoying the cooler air after a long day beside the loom. His fingers still ached from weaving. Hours of pulling thread through tight fibers left his hands stiff each evening. Tiny cuts crossed the skin near his thumbs where rough flax fibers had rubbed repeatedly. Beside him sat his elderly father, who once worked as a scribe before age weakened his eyes. The old man watched stars slowly appear above the rooftops. "When I was young," he said quietly, "storms frightened the city more than the villages." Pasharanta glanced toward him. "Why?" "Too many people packed close together. Dust entered every room. Everyone became restless." The old man smiled faintly. "And the rich complained more loudly." Pasharanta laughed softly beneath his breath. The sound quickly faded into the warm night. Around them, the city murmured gently with distant footsteps, quiet voices, barking dogs, and the creaking of wooden cartwheels somewhere far away. Ancient Egyptian cities could feel crowded and exhausting during daylight hours. Heat trapped itself between stone and mud brick walls. Dust filled the air. Markets overflowed with noise and movement. But nighttime softened everything. The streets grew calmer. Voices lowered. Even the busiest places seemed to breathe more slowly beneath darkness. Hours passed gently. Families drifted into sleep one by one across the valley. Oil lamps dimmed inside homes while tired workers stretched out upon mats after another difficult day beneath the sun. The Nile continued moving silently beside them all. Then, deep into the night, the wind began changing again. At first, almost no one noticed. A dry current moved quietly through the desert far beyond the fertile riverbanks. Sand shifted softly across empty dunes beneath moonlight. The air lost some of its cool softness and became slightly warmer. Only those awake outdoors sensed it immediately. Night fishermen paused while working their nets. Guards standing along temple walls glanced toward the desert horizon. A caravan leader resting beside tethered donkeys lifted his head slowly beneath the stars. The wind carried dryness again. Not strong yet, but familiar. Near the riverbank, Kai sat beside a small lantern repairing part of a fishing net while waiting for deeper night currents. He felt the warm shift in the air against his face. His hands stopped moving. For a long moment he listened quietly. The reeds no longer moved gently. Instead they rustled with a sharper sound. Kai looked toward the desert. Darkness hid most of the horizon, but faint dust already floated low against the distant stars. Another storm was forming somewhere far away. Not tonight perhaps. Maybe tomorrow. Maybe the next day. But it was coming. Kai sighed softly and returned to his work. There was nothing unusual about this. The desert never rested for long. By the final hours before dawn, the warm wind had spread across much of the valley. People sleeping near open windows shifted restlessly beneath the changing air. Dust drifted lightly along roads and courtyards again. Palm leaves rattled faintly in the darkness. Still, the villages remained mostly asleep. Inside one small riverside home, Izette woke briefly beside her children. The air felt warmer than earlier in the night. She could hear the wind moving softly outside the walls. For a moment she listened carefully. Then, tired from many days of work and interrupted sleep, she simply closed her eyes again. Morning would come soon enough. And with it would return the ordinary routines of life beside the Nile. Before sunrise, the first workers rose once more beneath the changing wind. Bakers lit ovens. Fishermen prepared boats. Farmers stepped quietly into dusty roads carrying tools toward the fields. The eastern horizon slowly brightened with pale silver light while the river reflected the first colors of dawn. Hori stood outside his bakery for a brief moment before beginning work. The warm dry air touched his face immediately. He looked toward the desert. The horizon seemed slightly blurred again. A younger apprentice beside him yawned sleepily. "Will there be another storm?" the boy asked. Hori watched the drifting haze quietly before answering. "Perhaps." Then he stepped inside toward the ovens glowing softly in the darkness. The day began again. Along the Nile, women carried water jars through early morning roads while children still slept inside warm homes. Donkeys groaned beneath loads of grain headed toward market towns. Boatmen loosened ropes beside the shore. The entire valley slowly awakened beneath the growing light. Yet beneath the ordinary routines, people sensed the desert watching them again. Not with fear. Not with surprise. Only with quiet understanding. Storms would always return eventually. The wind would rise again over the dunes. Dust would drift across the riverbanks. Villages would close their shutters against the roaring air while families gathered indoors beneath dim lamps. And afterward, life would continue once more beside the patient waters of the Nile. The morning unfolded slowly beneath a pale and dusty sky. Even before the sun rose fully above the eastern horizon, the warmth in the air already felt unusual. The cool softness that normally rested over the Nile before dawn had faded quickly during the night. In its place came a dry heaviness drifting quietly from the desert beyond the fertile valley. People noticed it without speaking much about it. Farmers walking toward the fields lifted their eyes toward the horizon. Fishermen standing beside boats paused briefly while studying the sky. Bakers opened shutters and frowned slightly at the fine dust already gathering along the window sills. The desert was breathing again. Inside the villages, life continued as always. Women swept courtyards before the heat grew stronger. Children rubbed sleep from their eyes while carrying baskets or helping fetch water from the river. Smoke from cooking fires rose softly into the warm morning air. Yet beneath these familiar routines lingered a quiet awareness. Another storm would come soon. Near the riverbank, Kai pushed his fishing boat into the Nile while his young son carried folded nets behind him. The boy looked toward the distant western cliffs where the air seemed hazy even this early in the day. "The sky looks tired," the child murmured softly. Kai glanced upward. The boy was right in a way. The sunlight lacked its usual sharp brightness. Instead, a pale golden haze covered the valley, softening the edges of palm trees, boats, and distant homes. Storm light. People beside the Nile knew it well. Kai stepped into the boat carefully while water lapped quietly against the wooden sides. Nearby fishermen moved more quickly than usual this morning. Most hoped to finish work before the wind strengthened later in the day. The Nile itself seemed calm for now. Reeds swayed gently beside the banks. White birds crossed low over the water searching for fish beneath the muted sunlight. Small ripples spread across the river surface where insects touched the water. For a little while, the world still felt peaceful. Farther inland, Mena and his sons worked in the fields repairing irrigation barriers before the expected storm arrived. Sandstorms often damaged the edges of canals or buried narrow water paths beneath drifting dust. The older farmer pressed wet mud carefully into a cracked section of canal wall while sweat already gathered along his forehead. His youngest son wiped dust from his eyes. "The wind feels strange today," the boy said quietly. Mena nodded without looking up. "It comes from deep desert." The boy stared toward the distant dunes beyond the cliffs. He had never traveled far into the open sands. Few ordinary villagers did unless work or trade required it. To most people beside the Nile, the desert felt enormous and unknowable. Beautiful from a distance. Dangerous up close. Yet it shaped every part of their lives. The stone used for temples came from desert quarries. Trade roads crossed dry wilderness toward distant lands. And always, the sand itself waited beside the fertile river valley, ready to drift inward whenever the wind called it. By mid-morning, the air grew hotter. Dust moved steadily through the roads between homes. Thin streams of sand gathered along walls and doorways. Merchants in the market began covering goods with cloth earlier than usual. Inside Hori's bakery, the ovens blazed fiercely while the dry air thickened around the workers. One apprentice coughed softly while kneading dough. "Drink more water," Hori murmured without looking up. The young boy nodded tiredly. Heat inside bakeries could become nearly unbearable before storms. The air stopped moving properly. Dust drifted through every opening. Sweat rolled constantly down faces and backs while flames roared inside clay ovens. Still, the bread had to be made. Customers continued arriving through the morning carrying baskets or jars for trade. A fisherman exchanged dried fish for warm loaves. An elderly woman brought onions wrapped carefully in cloth. Two laborers purchased bread before beginning a long walk toward quarry work near the cliffs. Everyone prepared quietly. Storms often trapped people indoors for many hours, so households gathered extra food and water whenever possible. Outside, the village no longer sounded relaxed. Wind rattled palm leaves sharply overhead. Loose cloth snapped against wooden poles. Dust hissed softly across the roads. Children noticed the change first. Their game slowed as they watched the sky darken little by little. One small girl stood beside her mother near a water well and pointed upward. "The sun looks sleepy," she whispered. Indeed, the sunlight had become strangely dim beneath the growing haze. Shadows softened. Distant buildings blurred behind drifting dust. Near noon, the first stronger gusts arrived. Sand lifted from the desert edges and crossed the valley in swirling waves close to the ground. Workers wrapped linen cloth over their mouths and noses. Farmers hurried animals toward shelter. Merchants lowered shutters across market stalls. The storm was approaching quickly now. In larger towns along the Nile, temple servants rushed to secure doors and cover sacred objects against blowing dust. Wealthy households ordered servants to close windows and bring furniture indoors from open courtyards. Across the valley, people moved with practiced calm rather than panic. They had done this many times before. Inside one weaving workshop near the market district, the women working at the looms paused briefly as dust drifted through the doorway. An older weaver sighed softly. "We should finish early today." No one argued. The air inside the workshop already felt difficult to breathe. Fine fibers from flax threads mixed with blowing dust, making throats dry and eyes sore. The women carefully covered unfinished cloth with linen sheets before beginning to clean the room. Wooden shutters closed against the strengthening wind outside. The world slowly dimmed. Near the river, Kai and the fishermen returned earlier than usual with their boats. The Nile had begun changing too. Wind roughened the water surface into small choppy waves. Visibility across the river decreased as dust thickened in the air. The fishermen worked quickly securing ropes and covering supplies before the storm worsened. Kai's son struggled to hold a cloth cover over stacked fishing baskets while the wind tugged sharply against it. "Hurry," Kai said gently but firmly. The boy nodded and kept pulling. Around them, the riverbank grew chaotic with movement. Boatmen shouted short instructions over the rising wind. Donkeys brayed nervously. Birds flew low toward shelter among thick reeds. Then came the smell. Dry. Earthy. Ancient. The smell of deep desert sand carried across the valley. Everyone recognized it instantly. By afternoon, the storm fully arrived. The sky darkened until daylight seemed almost unreal. Thick walls of dust rolled across the Nile Valley, swallowing roads, fields, boats, and villages beneath moving clouds of sand. Wind roared between the homes. Doors shook violently against wooden frames. Sand struck walls with a constant rushing hiss. Palm trees bent beneath powerful gusts while loose objects tumbled through empty roads. Inside the homes, families gathered close together once again. Oil lamps glowed dimly against the strange darkness. Fine grains of sand drifted endlessly through tiny cracks despite every effort to keep them out. Children pressed against parents while listening to the storm. The sound filled everything. Wind. Dust. Rattling shutters. Creaking wood. The storm became the entire world. In Hori's home, the family sat together near the center of the room away from windows and doors. His wife covered baskets of bread carefully with cloth while the youngest child watched sand moving beneath the doorway. "It sounds angry," the girl whispered. Hori shook his head softly. "No. Only strong." The child seemed to consider this carefully. Outside, visibility disappeared almost completely. Even nearby homes vanished behind the thick dust. Roads emptied. Animals huddled against walls or inside shelters while the desert swept through the valley once more. Yet slowly, after the first frightening hours passed, people settled into the familiar rhythm of storm time. The outside world no longer mattered for a while. Work stopped. Travel stopped. The endless labor paused again beneath the power of the wind. Inside homes, quieter activities began. Women repaired clothing beside dim lamps. Older children played small games scratched into the floor with stones or shells. Some people simply slept, wrapped in linen cloth while dust whispered endlessly outside. In one riverside home, an elderly storyteller named Nak sat with several children gathered around him while the storm raged beyond the walls. The old man's voice remained soft and calm. He spoke about long ago floods, ancient river journeys, and strange desert travelers crossing endless dunes beneath moonlight. The children listened silently. Storms often made stories feel larger somehow. The darkness outside turned small rooms into entire worlds of imagination. Nearby, one tired mother slowly braided her daughter's hair while listening to Nak speak. A baby slept against her chest despite the roaring wind. Time moved strangely during storms. Afternoon seemed endless beneath the dim sky. Without clear sunlight, people lost track of hours. The constant sound of wind blurred moments together until the world felt suspended between day and night. In the quarry settlements beyond the fields, laborers sheltered inside unfinished stone chambers carved into the cliffs. The storm outside struck the rock entrances with tremendous force. Dust swirled through the tunnels despite heavy cloth coverings placed over the openings. Beck sat with several workers sharing bread and watered beer beneath flickering lamplight. Stone dust already filled their lungs from ordinary labor. Now sandstorms added even more dryness and irritation to the air they breathed. One younger laborer coughed harshly into his arm. Another rubbed tired eyes swollen from dust. Still, there was relief too. No hauling stone today. No climbing under blazing sunlight. Only waiting. The men stretched sore muscles and rested aching hands while the storm raged outside the carved chambers. One worker leaned against the wall and closed his eyes. The constant wind almost sounded like ocean waves moving somewhere far away. As evening slowly approached, the storm reached its heaviest strength. The sky turned deep brown and gold above the hidden Nile. Darkness settled early across the valley. Lamps glowed inside homes long before true night arrived. Families gathered close during these hours. Meals were shared slowly in dim light while dust drifted endlessly through the rooms. Bread tasted faintly of sand no matter how carefully it was covered. Water jars required constant sealing against blowing grit. Yet there was warmth too. Human closeness. Shared stillness. Outside, the desert roared across ancient Egypt once more. But inside the homes beside the Nile, people waited patiently together while the wind carried the sands of the ancient world through the darkening night. The storm continued through the night without rest. Wind moved across the Nile Valley in long powerful waves, carrying endless curtains of sand through villages, fields, and riverbanks. The sound never fully stopped. It hissed against walls, rattled wooden shutters, and swept through narrow roads where no one walked anymore. Inside the homes, lamps glowed softly against the darkness. Families remained gathered together near the centers of their rooms, away from windows and doors where dust entered most heavily. Children who had once been frightened now grew sleepy listening to the endless rhythm of the storm outside. In Hori's house, the youngest daughter had fallen asleep against her mother's lap while the older son rested near the wall wrapped in a thin linen cloth. Hori himself remained awake. He sat quietly beside the doorway listening to the wind. The room smelled of warm bread, lamp smoke, and dry sand. Tiny grains drifted across the floor with each stronger gust outside. Occasionally the entire house creaked softly beneath the pressure of the storm. Yet the old baker felt strangely calm. Storm nights carried a different kind of silence beneath all the noise. Ordinary life disappeared completely for a while. No footsteps passed along the roads. No market voices rose from the village center. No donkeys carried grain through the streets. Only the wind remained. Hori leaned his head back against the wall and closed his tired eyes. His body welcomed the stillness after so many years of constant labor. Even now, during forced rest, he could feel pain lingering in his knees and lower back. The heat of the bakery ovens had lived inside his bones for decades. His hands remained rough and cracked from flour, fire, and heavy work. Storms interrupted routines, but they also allowed weary bodies to pause. Many workers secretly appreciated these hours despite the discomfort. Farther down the village road, Mena's family rested together inside their small home beside the fields. The old farmer's grandchildren sat close beside him listening to the storm while their parents prepared a simple evening meal over a low fire. The smell of lentils filled the warm room. Outside, sand piled steadily against the doorway. One child watched the drifting grains beneath the doorframe and whispered softly, "Will the whole village disappear?" Mena smiled faintly. "No. The village is stubborn." The children laughed quietly. The old farmer looked toward the dark ceiling above them while listening to the wind. He remembered storms from many years earlier when he himself had been a child sitting beside his own grandfather in another riverside home long gone now. Entire generations passed beside the Nile beneath the same storms. The same winds crossed the desert again and again through centuries. The same sand-buried roads entered homes and covered sleeping villages beneath thin golden dust. Human lives changed. The desert did not. Near the riverbank, Kai secured extra rope around his fishing boat before finally retreating indoors for the night. The Nile itself had almost disappeared beneath the storm darkness. Only the sound of rough water striking the shore remained. His son walked close beside him through the blowing sand. Even the short distance from riverbank to home felt difficult now. Wind pushed hard against their bodies while dust stung exposed skin and eyes. Inside their house, Kai's wife quickly closed the door behind them. The room felt warmer immediately. A small oil lamp flickered near the wall while a clay pot of fish stew simmered gently over low coals. The comforting smell filled the room. Kai brushed sand from his clothing and sat heavily onto a woven mat. His son coughed softly from breathing dust outside. The fisherman poured water from a clay jar into small cups for everyone. Even the water tasted faintly gritty during storms no matter how carefully people covered their supplies. Still, the family ate quietly together. Meals during storms often stretched longer than usual. With nowhere to go and no work possible outdoors, people slowed naturally into conversation, storytelling, or silence. Kai's son watched the lamp flame dance in the moving air. "Do storms happen on the river forever?" he asked sleepily. Kai looked toward the closed doorway where wind moaned softly outside. "Yes," he answered gently. "Long before us. Long after us." The boy nodded slowly, though his eyes had already begun drifting shut with sleep. Across the Nile Valley, similar scenes unfolded in countless homes. Workers rested sore bodies beside dim lamps. Mothers soothed tired children. Grandparents spoke softly about older storms and distant years. The storm wrapped itself around the ancient world while ordinary life folded inward for the night. Far north in the larger city districts, the storm created different sounds. There the wind moved between taller buildings and temple walls, producing deep hollow echoes through narrow streets and stone courtyards. Dust swirled through alleyways and gathered in thick drifts beside staircases and market stalls. Temple gates remained closed tightly. Inside one large temple complex, priests and servants rested within sheltered rooms while sand scraped endlessly across the outer walls. A young temple servant named Hui sat awake beside several baskets of grain stored carefully away from moisture and pests. His task was simple tonight: remain alert in case doors loosened or supplies needed protecting from blowing sand. He fought sleep heavily. The warm room and endless sound of wind made his eyelids droop again and again. Nearby, another servant already slept curled against the wall beneath a folded linen cloth. Hui stood slowly and stretched his aching legs. Earlier that day he had spent hours sweeping courtyards before the storm became too strong. Fine dust still coated his skin despite washing. His shoulders felt heavy with exhaustion. He walked quietly toward a narrow opening high in the wall and looked outside. Darkness and sand. Nothing more. The city beyond the temple had vanished completely beneath the storm. For a moment, Hui imagined how the valley must appear from far above, tiny lamps glowing faintly inside hidden villages while endless desert winds crossed the land around them. The thought made him feel strangely small. Then another strong gust rattled the shutters loudly, and he stepped back from the opening. Hours passed slowly. Deep into the night, many people drifted between sleep and waking as the storm continued outside. Some homes grew uncomfortably hot because doors and windows remained sealed tightly against the dust. Babies cried restlessly. Elderly people coughed from dry air irritating their lungs. Still, most families endured patiently. They had learned long ago that resistance accomplished little against storms. Better to wait calmly. Better to conserve energy and protect water and food supplies until the desert finished passing through. In one crowded workers' house near the quarries, Beck and several laborers remained awake longer than usual. The storm outside sounded especially fierce against the stone cliffs surrounding their settlement. Dust drifted constantly through the unfinished tomb chamber where they sheltered. One worker quietly rubbed oil into swollen wrists while another repaired a torn sandal strap beside the weak lamplight. Beck leaned against the cool stone wall and listened to the wind echo through the passageways. "It sounds alive tonight," one younger laborer whispered. An older worker shrugged slowly. "The desert is always alive." No one answered after that. The men sat quietly sharing watered beer and stale bread while fatigue slowly overtook them one by one. At last, near the deepest hour before dawn, the storm began weakening slightly. Not ending. Only softening. The wind no longer struck buildings with the same violent force. Dust still drifted heavily through the air, but the great roaring waves had become lower and more distant. People noticed the change even while half asleep. Inside homes, breathing relaxed. Children stopped waking so often. The valley itself seemed to exhale slowly after many exhausting hours. Outside, the desert continued moving beneath darkness. Sand crossed empty roads and buried footprints made earlier that day. Palm trees rustled softly beneath the remaining wind. Boats rocked gently beside invisible riverbanks. Then slowly, almost unnoticed at first, dawn approached once more. The eastern sky lightened faintly behind the thick dusty air. Inside Hori's home, the baker opened his eyes before sunrise as always. For a moment he forgot about the storm entirely. Then he heard the softer wind outside. He sat up carefully. His joints ached badly from sleeping on the hard floor, but the familiar rhythm of work already called him forward again. Beside him, his family still slept. The youngest child held one hand over her face to block drifting dust even in sleep. Hori smiled faintly at the sight. Then he stood slowly and moved toward the door. When he opened it slightly, cool dusty air slipped into the room. The storm had weakened considerably. The village outside looked pale and strange beneath early morning light. Sand covered nearly everything. Drifts leaned against walls and doorways. Palm leaves and broken reeds littered the roads. Yet the village still stood. Already, a few other early workers stepped cautiously outdoors. A woman swept sand from her entrance. A fisherman checked the ropes securing his boat. 2 bakers hurried through the dusty streets carrying fuel for ovens. Life began returning immediately. Ancient Egypt rarely remained still for long. By sunrise, the wind had faded into a steady dry breeze moving across the valley. The Nile slowly emerged again from the haze. Palm trees became visible beyond the drifting dust. Birds returned cautiously to the reeds beside the water. Everywhere, people stepped outside to inspect the storm's work. Children climbed excitedly over fresh sand drifts gathered beside homes. Farmers stared wearily at fields partly covered in dust. Merchants uncovered market stalls and brushed sand from jars, baskets, and cloth. The cleanup would take many hours. Perhaps days in some places. But no one complained loudly. Storms belong to life beside the Nile just as surely as floods, heat, harvests, and long labor beneath the sun. Hori walked slowly toward the bakery through roads transformed by the night wind. His sandals sank softly into fresh sand with each step. The air smelled deeply of desert earth. Ahead of him, the village slowly awakened once more beneath the pale golden light of morning while the ancient world continued its endless rhythm beside the patient waters of the Nile. Morning spread slowly across the valley after the long storm night. The sunlight arrived softly through the dusty air, pale and muted instead of bright. Fine grains of sand still drifted gently through the breeze, glowing gold where the early light touched them. The Nile moved quietly beside the villages, half hidden beneath lingering haze rising above the water. Everywhere, the storm had left its mark. Roads were uneven beneath fresh sand drifts. Palm branches lay scattered beside walls and courtyards. Market stalls stood coated in fine dust despite heavy coverings tied over them the previous day. Yet already, the people beside the river had begun cleaning, repairing, sweeping, lifting, carrying, and rebuilding. Life resumed almost immediately. Near the center of the village, women pushed sand away from their doorways using bundles of reeds while children helped gather broken baskets and loose cloth carried by the wind during the night. Some children treated the storm remains like a game. A small group climbed laughing over a pile of drifted sand beside a storage wall while an older grandmother shook her head with tired amusement. "Careful," she murmured. "There may be scorpions hiding beneath." The children jumped away immediately before slowly creeping back again once their fear faded. The old woman smiled softly and continued sweeping. Ancient Egyptian villages woke gradually after storms. No one rushed. The cleanup itself became part of the rhythm of the day. People paused often to stretch tired backs or wipe sweat from dusty faces. Neighbors shared tools and helped lift damaged roofing or clear blocked pathways. The storm had touched everyone equally. Near the bakery, Hori stood outside studying the doorway half buried beneath blown sand. One of the younger apprentices stared at the drift with wide tired eyes. "That was not there yesterday," the boy whispered. Hori nodded quietly. "Then we move it today." The two began shoveling slowly using flat wooden boards and baskets. Sand poured heavily from the entrance onto the road while dust rose around their legs beneath the warming morning light. Inside the bakery, the ovens still needed lighting. Storm or no storm, people would soon want bread. The younger workers swept flour tables clean while coughing softly from lingering dust in the air. One apprentice climbed onto a stool to brush sand away from the upper shelves where clay bowls and jars were stored. The bakery smelled of ash, warm clay, and dry desert air. Outside, customers already waited quietly despite the storm damage. Workers heading toward the fields wanted food before beginning another difficult day. Boatmen preparing river travel needed bread wrapped in cloth for long journeys. Laborers from the quarry settlements arrived carrying baskets for trade. The ordinary hunger of life continued. As the sun rose higher, heat slowly returned across the valley. The brief coolness brought by the storm vanished beneath warming air. Dusty roads shimmered softly in the sunlight. Villagers wiped sweat from their necks while continuing cleanup work. Near the Nile, Kai and his son inspected their fishing boat carefully. Sand coated the inside of the vessel in thin golden layers. One rope had frayed badly during the storm winds. A wooden storage box had broken loose and drifted halfway into the reeds. Kai crouched beside the boat, rubbing one hand across the rough wood. The river smelled fresh again now that the heavy winds had faded. Wet mud and reeds carried their familiar scent through the morning air. His son pointed toward the opposite riverbank where haze still floated low over the water. "It looks like smoke," the child said softly. Kai followed his gaze. The boy was right. The drifting dust above the Nile often resembled pale smoke after storms, especially during early morning light. It moved slowly above the river surface while boats emerged gradually from the haze like quiet shadows. Nearby, other fishermen worked silently repairing nets and untangling ropes. One older fisherman sneezed repeatedly while brushing sand from his beard. Another laughed softly. "The desert wanted to fish with us last night." A few tired smiles appeared among the men. Then they returned to work. By late morning, markets slowly reopened across the villages and towns. Merchants uncovered baskets of onions, figs, fish, pottery, and cloth while brushing away fine dust with woven fans. Donkeys moved carefully through crowded roads still softened by drifting sand. The atmosphere felt slower than usual. Storm days exhausted people even after they ended. Sleep remained heavy in tired eyes. Bodies moved carefully after restless nights filled with blowing dust and endless wind noise. Yet business continued. Near one market stall, a linen seller carefully shook sand from folded cloth while speaking quietly with a customer about the storm. "My roof nearly lifted away," the seller muttered. The customer nodded calmly. "Our courtyard filled with sand higher than my knees." Neither sounded dramatic. Only tired. Storms belonged to ordinary conversation the same way people discussed heat, harvests, or river levels. Across the market road, a potter inspected several cracked jars damaged when wind toppled part of his drying shelves during the night. He sighed softly but did not appear angry. Breakage was expected sometimes. Life beside the desert rarely allowed perfection. Farther south near the farming villages, Mena and his sons worked slowly clearing sand from irrigation channels. The storm had blown dust deep into the narrow waterways feeding their crops. Without cleaning, the water flow would weaken beneath the growing heat of the coming days. Mena stood knee-deep in mud using a flat wooden shovel to scrape wet sand from the canal bottom. Sweat rolled steadily down his lined face. His back hurt badly this morning. Storm nights often made old pain worse. The dry air stiffened joints. Sleeping poorly on hard mats left muscles tight and aching by sunrise. Still, the fields needed tending. Nearby, one of his sons paused and stretched slowly. "The canal farther east is nearly blocked," he called out. Mena nodded tiredly. "We will reach it before evening." The work felt endless sometimes. Yet there was calmness inside repetition too. The steady movement of water through canals. The scrape of shovels in wet earth. The sound of insects humming near the reeds. Life beside the Nile unfolded through thousands of small repeated tasks. Without them, nothing survived. By midday, the sun burned strongly once more above the valley. The lingering storm haze slowly thinned, revealing clearer blue sky beyond the drifting dust. Heat settled heavily over fields, roads, rooftops, and workshops. Workers sought shade wherever possible. Near the riverbanks, fishermen rested beneath woven canopies repairing nets while drinking cool water from clay jars. Farmers sat briefly beneath palm trees before returning to the canals. Market sellers covered their heads with linen cloth against the harsh light. Inside a crowded weaving workshop, the women who had closed early during the storm returned to their looms. The room felt warm and close. Dust still floated visibly in narrow beams of sunlight entering through small wall openings. Flax fibers clung to sweaty skin while loom frames creaked softly beneath steady hands. One younger weaver rubbed sore eyes. "The storm left sand in everything," she murmured. An older woman beside her smiled faintly. "It always does." The looms continued their slow rhythm. Wood creaked. Threads tightened. Feet pressed steadily against pedals near the floor. Outside, the world shimmered beneath afternoon heat. Children grew quieter during these hours, retreating indoors or resting in shaded corners beside cool clay walls. Dogs slept beneath carts. Donkeys stood motionless near water troughs flicking flies away with tired tails. Even the birds seemed slower. Ancient Egypt often paused beneath midday sunlight. The land itself felt exhausted. In the quarry settlements beyond the fertile valley, workers finally returned to hauling stone after losing 2 days to storm conditions. Beck stood with several laborers beside a limestone block half-carved from the cliff face. The sun reflected painfully off the pale stone around them. Already, sweat soaked through their linen clothing. One worker hammered copper tools carefully into cracks along the rock while others prepared ropes and wooden sledges for moving the block. Dust rose with every strike. Stone dust. Sand dust. The air itself always carried dryness here. Beck flexed his sore fingers before gripping the rope again. Tiny blisters had reopened along his palms from yesterday's cleanup work after the storm. His body longed for rest. But labor resumed quickly in ancient Egypt because survival depended upon it. Temples still needed stone. Officials still demanded shipments. Construction never truly stopped for long. During a brief pause, Beck looked toward the distant Nile barely visible through the hot haze beyond the cliffs. He imagined the cooler river breeze there. The sound of reeds moving beside water. The smell of bread from village ovens. Then another worker called his name, and he returned to the ropes. As afternoon slowly softened toward evening, the valley changed once more. The harsh white heat mellowed into warm gold light spreading across fields and rooftops. Shadows lengthened beside palm trees. The worst of the day finally loosened its grip on tired bodies. People emerged again from shaded shelters and cool interiors. Children resumed games along dusty roads. Women gathered near the river to wash clothing while talking quietly together. Merchants counted remaining goods before packing away market stalls. The world breathed easier. Near the riverbank, Kai's son sat watching the sunset colors spread across the Nile while his father finished repairing a torn net. The boy traced shapes absent-mindedly through the fresh sand gathered beside the boat. "Will another storm come tomorrow?" he asked quietly. Kai looked toward the western desert where the cliffs glowed red beneath the evening light. "Perhaps not tomorrow," he said softly. "But always someday." The child nodded slowly. He was beginning to understand. Storms were not interruptions to life here. They were part of life itself. Like heat. Like river floods. Like growing old. As darkness slowly returned across ancient Egypt, lamps glowed once more inside homes still dusted with traces of desert sand. Families gathered quietly after another long day of labor, cleanup, and heat beside the patient flowing waters of the Nile. Night returned gently to the Nile Valley after the long dusty day. The final glow of sunset faded behind the western cliffs while darkness slowly filled the roads between the villages. Warm air drifted softly through palm leaves beside the river. Lamps flickered inside mud-brick homes, casting small pools of golden light against walls still carrying traces of storm dust. The world felt quieter tonight. Not silent, but softened. After days of wind and cleanup work, exhaustion rested heavily upon the people beside the Nile. Bodies moved slower. Conversations remained calm and low. Even the animals seemed tired beneath the lingering heat. Near the market roads, merchants finished covering baskets and jars before returning home through dimly lit streets. Donkeys stood half asleep beside wooden fences. Dogs wandered lazily through drifting shadows searching for scraps near cooking fires. The smell of evening meals filled the air. Bread. Roasted onions. Fish cooked slowly over coals. Warm lentils mixed with herbs. Ancient Egypt often smelled strongest at night when daytime heat no longer swallowed every scent beneath dry air and dust. Inside Hori's home, the family sat together near a small oil lamp while his wife repaired a torn linen sleeve using careful stitches. Hori leaned back against the wall with tired legs stretched before him. His knees hurt badly tonight. The cleanup after the storm had forced him to shovel heavy sand before spending long hours beside the bakery ovens. His hands still carried tiny cracks filled with flour dust no matter how often he washed them. Across the room, his youngest daughter slowly drifted toward sleep while listening to the quiet sound of her mother's sewing needle passing through cloth. The older son sat near the doorway watching darkness settle outside. The roads look different after storms, he murmured softly. Hori nodded. They forget where they were. The boy smiled faintly at that thought. Outside, wind moved gently through the village now. Not storm wind. Only ordinary night air drifting from the desert across the valley. The storm already felt distant. Yet traces remained everywhere. Sand still lined the corners of rooms. Dust-coated rooftops and market awnings. Some people still coughed from breathing dry air during the worst hours of the storm. Near the riverbank, Kai sat beside his fishing boat sharpening a small bronze hook beneath lantern light. His son rested nearby with his head against a bundled fishing net, fighting sleep while listening to frogs croaking among the reeds. The Nile moved quietly beside them. At night, the river often seemed larger somehow. Darkness erased the far banks and softened the movement of the water until the Nile felt endless beneath the stars. Kai paused his work for a moment and looked upward. The sky had cleared beautifully after the storm. Countless stars stretched above the valley. The desert cliffs beyond the river appeared dark and still beneath moonlight. The fishermen breathed slowly. There was comfort in these peaceful nights after storms passed. The air smelled cleaner. The silence felt deeper. Even exhaustion became softer beside the calm river. His son opened sleepy eyes and whispered, "Tell me about the storm you saw when you were little." Kai smiled faintly. "My father told me not to stand near the doorway," he began quietly. "But I kept watching outside anyway." The child listened carefully. The sky turned almost black from sand. "I thought night had come in the middle of the day." "What happened then?" Kai continued sharpening the hook slowly while speaking. "My mother covered all the water jars with cloth. My father tied ropes around the roof beams. And afterward, we spent 2 days digging sand away from the animal pens. The boy laughed softly. Did you help? A little. The child seemed satisfied with this answer. Nearby, another fisherman hummed quietly while repairing a net beside a small fire. The gentle melody drifted over the dark water along with the smell of smoke and wet reeds. Farther north in the larger towns, nighttime routines unfolded beneath the cooling sky. Temple servants carried fresh oil for lamps through quiet stone halls. Guards walked slowly along walls holding bronze-tipped spears and shaded lanterns. Bakers prepared grain before dawn work began again. In one narrow alley behind a crowded marketplace, Pasharanta the linen weaver sat beside his elderly father outside their small home. The old man rubbed sore knees while staring thoughtfully toward the stars overhead. The air feels younger tonight, he murmured. Pasharanta smiled faintly. You say strange things when you are tired. The old man chuckled softly. Age had slowed him greatly in recent years. His eyesight weakened each season, and his hands no longer remained steady enough for writing work. Yet he still loved sitting outside after dark listening to the distant sounds of the city settling into sleep. Tonight the city sounded calm. No storm winds rushed through the alleys. No market shouting echoed between buildings. Only quiet footsteps, distant dogs, and the occasional creak of wooden cartwheels moving through the darkness. Pasharanta leaned back against the wall beside his father. My fingers still ache from weaving, he admitted quietly. They always will. The old man's voice carried no sadness. Only simple understanding. Work shaped every body in ancient Egypt. Farmers bent permanently from years in the fields. Stone workers lost strength in their hands. Weavers developed stiff shoulders and cracked fingertips. Boatmen carried deep rope scars across their palms. People expected such things. Pain arrived slowly through ordinary life. Deep into the countryside, near the farming villages south of the city, Mena's family had already gone to sleep. The old farmer lay awake briefly beside his wife listening to insects singing outside the windows. Cool air drifted gently through the room carrying the smell of damp earth from the nearby canals. Tomorrow would bring another long day repairing water channels and checking crops after the storm. The labor never ended fully. But for now, the fields rested beneath moonlight. The irrigation canals reflected silver light through the darkness while frogs croaked among the reeds. Farther away, the desert stretched silently beyond the fertile valley, calm once more after its restless winds. Mena closed his eyes slowly. His body felt deeply tired. Yet beneath the exhaustion rested something peaceful too, the quiet satisfaction of surviving another storm, another season, another year beside the Nile. Across the valley, more lamps dimmed one by one. Families drifted into sleep beneath thin linen coverings. Children curled beside parents on woven mats. Workers stretched aching muscles before finally surrendering to rest. The ancient world softened into darkness. Hours passed quietly. The moon climbed higher above the desert cliffs while coolness spread gently through the villages. Sand settled motionless across rooftops and roads. Boats rocked softly beside the shore. Then, sometime during the deepest part of night, a faint breeze returned from the desert. Not strong. Not dangerous. Only enough to stir the palm leaves and carry a dry scent across the valley. A few light sleepers noticed it. Kai opened his eyes briefly beside the riverbank fire where he had drifted into shallow sleep. He listened to the wind for a moment, then relaxed again when no stronger gust followed. Far away beyond the cliffs, dunes shifted quietly beneath moonlight. The desert never truly slept. Even during peaceful nights, sand continued moving across ancient roads and empty wilderness. Tiny grains traveled endlessly through darkness carried by unseen winds. In many ways, the people beside the Nile understood this deeply. Life itself felt similar. Always moving. Always changing little by little. Children became workers. Workers became elders. Villages grew, faded, and were rebuilt again. Storms came and passed. The river flowed onward through it all. Before dawn arrived, bakers once again stirred from sleep. Hori woke with sore knees and stiff shoulders before the stars had faded. He sat quietly for a moment beside his sleeping family while listening to the calm outside. No storm tonight. Only stillness. He stood slowly and stepped into the cool darkness carrying fuel for the bakery ovens. Other early workers already moved through the roads. A fisherman carrying nets. A water carrier balancing clay jars. A servant hurrying toward a wealthy household before sunrise. The village awakened gently beneath fading stars. Soon the first bread would bake again. Soon farmers would walk toward the fields. Soon market stalls would reopen beside dusty roads. The endless rhythm of ancient Egypt continued beneath the soft approach of another sunrise beside the patient waters of the Nile. The night grew deeper beside the Nile. One by one, the final lamps faded inside the mud-brick homes. The quiet roads rested beneath soft moonlight, still carrying thin traces of desert sand left behind by the storms. Palm leaves whispered gently in the cool darkness while the river moved slowly through the sleeping valley, calm and steady as it had for countless generations. The workers slept. The bakers with tired knees and flour-covered hands. The fishermen smelling faintly of reeds and river water. The farmers whose backs ached from bending over wet soil beneath the sun. The weavers with sore fingers. The servants carrying water before dawn. The stone laborers resting heavy bodies after long days beneath the cliffs. All of them drifted quietly into sleep while ancient Egypt rested around them. Far beyond the fertile banks of the Nile, the desert stretched endlessly beneath the stars. The dunes moved softly in the night wind. Sand traveled slowly across ancient roads and forgotten footprints. Somewhere far away, another storm was already forming beyond the dark horizon, patient and distant. But here beside the river, everything felt peaceful now. The water brushed gently against tied wooden boats. Frogs sang softly among the reeds. A faint breeze drifted through open windows carrying the cool scent of night air and damp earth from the canals. Inside one small home, a child turned sleepily beneath a linen cloth while his father breathed slowly nearby after another long day of labor. In another village farther north, an old fisherman slept beside folded nets waiting for the next sunrise upon the river. Across the valley, thousands of quiet dreams rested beneath the same ancient sky. And above them all, the stars remained bright over the Nile. Timeless. Still. Watching silently as the warm desert night carried the ancient world gently toward morning. The river continued flowing through darkness. The wind softened. The lamps faded completely. And slowly, peacefully, beside the quiet waters of ancient Egypt, the world drifted into silence and sleep.